Shannon Watkins, and I am here today with the Martin Center's president, Jenna Robinson, to discuss her thoughts on the topic of student loan forgiveness. So Jenna, there's been some recent talk by Joe Biden and Democratic Senate leaders about student loan forgiveness. What have they been proposing?
So Shannon, there are really two different plans that have been floating around, and I think the more radical one is being proposed by Schumer and Warren and other, as you said, Democratic Senate leaders. They want to see up to $50,000 of student loan forgiveness, and they want Biden, once he is sworn in, to do it via executive order. And that came out recently in an interview with Chuck Schumer about what he wants to see in the first 100 days. And he said he wants FDR-like action, and he sees this massive student loan forgiveness as part of that. Biden, on the other hand, has been a lot more circumspect. He said he wants to see $10,000 of loan cancellation as part of a coronavirus relief package, and he wants to see it passed by Congress. So obviously, those are two kind of wildly different plans, even though they are both about student loan forgiveness.
What do you think about this idea of student loan forgiveness, about their plan?
I think there are a lot of problems with student loan forgiveness. First, it's very regressive. People who have gone to college on average are doing far better economically than those who haven't gone, especially right now in this economic downturn, in these shutdowns. The people who are most likely to be out of work right now are not college graduates. They're people who are working in low-wage jobs. They're not white-collar workers. And so to do a student loan forgiveness right now would be, just extremely regressive, and I think a little bit tone deaf on the part of the administration or Congress or whoever wants to propose student loan forgiveness. Of course, it's very popular amongst people on Twitter because everybody on Twitter has gone to college, and it's kind of the chattering classes have all gone to college. But I think that it really is a regressive plan. It's also unfair because borrowers chose to go to college. They chose to take out student loans, and universities sometimes make grandiose promises, but nonetheless, it is the borrower who has to sign on the dotted line. And forgiving the loans shifts the burden from someone who, chose the loans willingly to taxpayers in general, many of whom never went to college and who certainly didn't decide to take on that debt. But I think the biggest problem with student loan forgiveness is that it fails to tackle the underlying issue, which is that borrowing for college doesn't always pay off in the ways that people think it will. That's why there is a quote unquote student loan crisis. We don't talk about a mortgage loan crisis until there is an underlying problem in the housing market. And the same is true for student loans. Borrowing for college is only a problem because it's not giving people the returns that they want. Now, that said, most people who borrow do pay it back. They pay it back on a schedule that is more or less on time. But there are some people who are hurt by student loans. People who fail to graduate from college are in an especially bad place because they have gotten debt for their degree, but then no degree, which means that there's no job and no pay bump to go along with it. There are some people who borrow too much compared to their anticipated earnings. And this happens a lot. If a student goes to an expensive private school, takes out, $50,000 or $60,000 for a job where the entry pay is only $30,000 a year, that's a mismatch. And that person is going to struggle to repay their loans. And I think part of the problem is that there's a failure of universities to let students know their real post-graduation prospects. And they fail to let students know their actual chance of graduating in the first place. So I think there is universities are giving students misinformation, and students are borrowing thinking that getting into a university is like the golden ticket, and they are not going to have to worry about paying loans because they're going to have a fantastic post-graduation job, and that just doesn't pan out for people. And so those are the people who have gotten into trouble with their loans, and those issues won't be solved by a student loan forgiveness, obviously people who are suffering will be made better off, but another generation of students will be right behind them to take on loans that they may not be able to afford. And so I think we have to address those underlying problems.
If adopted, what will these policies mean for the future of higher ed?
I think what they would mean is that we would get more of the same. We'd get more bad behavior. There'd be no incentive for universities to reform, and tuition would continue to balloon because both universities and students would know that the federal government has made a precedent of forgiving loans. And that would mean that students would feel comfortable taking on loans, maybe even taking on bigger loans than they had in the past, and that universities would feel comfortable raising their tuition because they know that there's going to be this appetite from students to borrow. And I think all of that is moving in the wrong direction instead of, solving all of the problems in higher education.
What policies then should the federal government pursue instead?
So I think there are a couple of things that the federal government can do. One thing that it is already doing is there is something called income-based repayment. And so we hear a lot right now from borrowers who are struggling. And I think that what they can do right now is tell those borrowers who are struggling that instead of asking for forgiveness or campaigning for forgiveness or whatever, that they should move into an income-based repayment plan. Of course, that only has to do with the federal loans. And so they can also um, create bankruptcy protections for private loans after a suitable waiting period. And if we look back to pre-2005, we did have those protections for private student loan borrowers. And I think that we have only gotten to the problems we have now after those bankruptcy protections were eliminated. And so I think we need to go back to the way that things were before everything was tightened up in 2005. I think we should also consider looking at the caps on federal borrowing. Right now, they are in a pretty good place for undergraduate borrowing, but the caps on borrowing for graduate students and for parents of undergraduate students, I think really should be considered. Those are often called they're called plus loans. And I think that the government might want to even consider eliminating those plus loans because they often get people into debt far over their heads. They should also institute some more transparency in student loans. And I think one way to do that would be to start looking at repayment rates instead of default rates to evaluate whether universities should be eligible for student loans at all. Obviously, a university has to qualify in order for students to be able to use federal student loans to go there. And one of the criteria is that they can't have more than a certain percent of students who default in a 3-year period. But the problem with the default rates is that they only capture people who are, as I said, defaulting within this one very small period. And it doesn't look at all about the other students who are struggling but not in default. So a better way to look at it and to measure how a university is doing is to flip it on its head, not say how many people are in dire straits, but how many former students are actively repaying on their loans. And by using that metric, we'll get a better handle on which universities are encouraging responsible lending and are giving their students good outcomes for the money that they're spending. The last thing that I would really like to see is what's called skin in the game. And skin in the game means that universities would somehow be on the hook for at least a portion of the money that students borrow to attend. And I think that that would really change the incentives of universities. It would mean that they had better incentives for graduating their students, better incentives to make sure that their students are borrowing the right amounts of money, going into majors that are going to work out for them, and just they would have more incentive to make sure that their students are successful. And so I think that those are the kind of reforms we should be looking at instead of student loan forgiveness.
Great. Well, Jenna, thank you for offering your insights on this really important issue. I encourage everyone viewing this video to visit us at our website, www jamesgmartin.center. We will be following the topic of student loan forgiveness closely as is discussed in the public square. And thank you very much for watching this video today.
Thank you, Shannon.